Ever notice one of those little Google Doodles popping up in your browser sometime between Easter and the start of May, the 23rd of April? Oh look, apparently it's St. George's Day. So what's this all about? Well, maybe you've heard of St. George, maybe you haven't. As someone who's always been aware of England's patron saint for as long as I can remember, I was surprised to find out that people I know, native English, some spanning generations, not only didn't know when St. George's Day was, that was pretty common I thought, but they didn't know about the day at all. And what really shocked me was that some had never even heard of its namesake, St. George, the guy our country's flag is named after. I'd already resolved myself to doing something a little more than the usual quiet contemplation of my English identity and heritage this year, but as well as getting hold of some red and white bunting, I decided I'd make my first video as an excuse to do some research, exploring my ideas a little deeper and to spread the message about the 23rd of April. Right then, what's the deal with St. George? Much like the world-famous St. Patrick's Day for the Irish, including the Northern Irish, each country in Great Britain has its own patron saint and its own day to celebrate them. Wales has St. David, Scotland has St. Andrew, and England has St. George. So, two questions. Of all the hundreds or thousands of saints out there, depending how you count them, why were these four adopted as the patron saints for the British Isles? And while we're at it, what's the point of a patron saint anyway? In Christian tradition, particularly for Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, patron saints are thought to be a kind of heavenly advocate for people's prayers to reach God's ear, effectively working like a friend on the inside to help you get your voice heard by the big man. It's known as intercession, and as we'll be finding out, St. George is no exception in stepping up to this role. These heavenly representatives can be adopted to intercede on behalf of nations, regions, cities, people of certain trades, clans, families, pretty much any group that wants to claim one. Heck, why not get your own personal patron while you're at it? You wouldn't be the first. And the specific saints are often chosen because of some historical link to that group of people, or because of something more symbolic that people feel particularly inspired by, or that resonates with them on some level. If we look at the four we mentioned so far, we can see that some were native to, or somehow significant to, their associated country in their lifetime. St. Patrick, for example, is given credit for bringing Christianity to Ireland during the 5th century. St. David was a high-ranking Welsh clergyman, born in Wales later in the same century or early in the next. However, the other two patrons are a little less clear. St. Andrew was one of Christ's 12 apostles, and although legends state that he may have visited Fife to build a church, thereby essentially creating the town of St. Andrews, or that his remains made a posthumous journey there, there does seem to be insufficient evidence to back up any of these claims. There are also many legends linking St. George to England for similar reasons, visiting the country, for example, or the piece of his skull and other body parts supposedly gifted by a continental emperor as relics to be kept in the chapel at Windsor. But it seems there aren't any substantiated links to England in particular relating to the life of the saint. So, as many critics of the holiday would ask, why then should we celebrate St. George? Modern considerations like secularism aside, England has a long and colourful history with St. George, spanning an impressive 1,000 years or so, and was likely known in these lands as far back as the 7th century, predating the country of England as we know it. In a sense, he's been here from the birth of a nation to the present day. Although many would claim it still makes little sense for him to be the poster boy of a country he's never stepped foot on, it's actually quite common for countries across Europe to be represented by a foreign saint. As historian Ian Mortimer put it in a 2006 essay, Scotland's St. Andrew was a New Testament figure, as was Spain's St. James. St. Nicholas, Russia and Greece, came from Turkey. Ireland's St. Patrick came from mainland Britain. France's St. Denis was an Italian missionary. Germany's St. Boniface came from England. The Portuguese, Venetians, Maltese, Georgians and Lithuanians all have St. George, the most cosmopolitan of all patron saints. In fact, St. David's, Wales, is very rare in being a saint who actually came from the region of which he's now patron. As he goes on to state, clearly it does not matter where a saint came from. It is what he stands for, the message of his life, which is important. In all the cases above, St. George stands out as unique in one respect. His message has absolutely nothing to do with converting people to Christianity. St. George stands for the courage to face adversity in order to defend the innocent. The triumph of good over evil through courage. Personally, I largely agree with the spirit of this stance, despite the fact that conversions do play a role in many versions of the legend. I would argue that adopting a saint from foreign lands also makes sense historically speaking. The medieval church was powerful. Monasteries, priories, churches, and cathedrals formed an extensive network that connected the whole of Christendom in their faith, something we might find harder to appreciate in a modern, largely secular society. Thus, no region had exclusive claim over a holy figure. Ever-changing populations as land was lost and conquered, as well as limited knowledge of the outside world, would also have created a much more localized in-group within communities and the regions they occupied. As such, this renders our modern lens, with nation-states as a societal norm, somewhat alien to the times in which St. George's patronage was initially spreading in the European continent. Lastly, given the popular folktales serving as the best-known representation of St. George today, he can come across as more of a fictional figure than a real person of antiquity. Even if St. Nicholas is still doing all right alongside his jolly alter ego, why should we celebrate some fictional suit of armour who's not even bringing us presents? The scepticism is understandable, given the many fantastical stories and forms that our patron took. Throughout time, he's been seen as a martyr, a warrior, a knight, a hero, and even a disembodied representation of spirit, valour, and colonial might of the English. To understand the many faces of this character, let's take a look at two main versions of the story. The Codex Gallicanus, lost for hundreds of years but rediscovered in 1874, offers a comically far-fetched account of the saint's martyrdom, which goes roughly as follows. Dadianus, king of Persia, takes it upon himself to persecute the Christians, and George, an officer in his army, decides to give away all his money to the poor and confess his Christian faith. The king, displeased at this, commands that he give sacrifice to the statues of Apollo and Poseidon, but he curses them instead and is punished immediately. What follows is nothing but the most extreme and brutal torture. I'm not sadistic enough to go into too much detail, but being cut into pieces, boiled alive, and having his head smashed in with a hammer somehow wasn't enough to do him in. After somehow surviving this first day of torment, God appears in the night to warn him that he'll die 4 times, and on the 4th death, he will finally enter paradise. So, over the next 7 years, still attended by his loyal servant, George continues to confess his faith and continues to endure the agony. Between all the gruesome torture sessions and coming back to life even after being dismembered into 10 pieces, he still finds the time to raise the dead, cure the blind, and convince Apollo to admit to being a false god, thereby convincing nearly all who bore witness to his miracles, including a magician, thousands of soldiers, and even the king's wife, to convert. Sadly for them, they're all promptly executed, even the wife. Eventually, the unrepentant George too is finally condemned to death, and shortly before his head's removed, he offers up a prayer that God will grant favour to all that pray in his name. After this 4th and final death is complete, God rains down a firestorm to smite Dadianus. Here's a translation of the Coptic version to hear some of what George said. Now there was a young man whose name was George, the son of truth and the glorious star between heaven and earth. He was a tribune to the imperial army and came from Cappadocia. And when he had served his time as tribune and acquired much wealth, he came to the governor, Dadianus, and wished to be made a count by him. When St. George came to the city and saw the frenzied idolatry of the governors and that they had forsaken God, he immediately decided to give up his rank of tribune, saying, I will become a soldier of my Lord Jesus Christ, the King of heaven. And when he had distributed all his wealth and given what he had to the poor, he rushed into the presence of the governors and cried out, saying, Cease your frenzy, O governors, and proclaim not to be gods the things which are not gods. As for me, I will worship one God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. The dragon looked at him and said, Every person who has gone forth from the benevolent guidance of the gods perishes, and as for us, we worship things which are beneath the heavens. For the gods, fire and sun appear to us mighty beings. Know now that you have not only insulted us, but you have also insulted the righteous gods. Offer sacrifice then to the gods and to Apollo, who is the saviour of the whole world, and be convinced that the gods whom you insult know those who honour and obey them, and know how to punish those who disobey them. And now tell me where you come from. What is your name, and for what purpose have you come here? St. George answered and said, The chief name which I bear is Christian. I am by birth a Cappadocian. I was a soldier in a famous company, and I served with honour in Palestine. Who are the gods whom you would force me to worship, O king?" The governor said to him, "I desire that you worship Apollo, who hung out the heavens, and Poseidon, who made fast the earth." St. George answered and said, "Neither for your sake, O evil dragon, nor for that of the governors your companions, will I speak about the righteous ones and your dead God, but for the sake of those multitudes here present. Whom would you compel me to worship, O king? Peter the chosen one of the apostles, or Apollo, who corrupts the whole world?" The air of defiance in his words is palpable. The canonical version of the tale changed a few details, such as making the tortures harmless enough that he did not have to be raised from the dead more times than Jesus. Sounds a bit heretical when you put it like that. Also, the rewrite reduces the length of the torture from 7 years to a slightly more believable 7 days, and tries to lend an air of historical accuracy by changing the character Dedianus to famous persecutor of Christians, Roman Emperor Diocletian. The later and better known version of the story, made popular by Jacobus de Voragine in his 1266 Golden Legend, Legenda Aurea, goes as follows. The story takes place in Cyrene, in Libya, where the people of the city were plagued by a dragon that lived in a nearby pond, poisoning the countryside with the venom he spewed. To prevent it from affecting the city, the people brought 2 sheep each day, then a man and a sheep, and then finally they offered up their young, using a lottery to decide the unfortunate victim. On one occasion, the lot fell on the king's own daughter. Desperate not to lose her to the dragon, the king offered all his gold and silver to have his daughter spared, but the people refused. The king resigned himself to his daughter's fate, and she was sent out to the lake dressed as a bride to be offered up and fed to the beast. Before the dragon came, George appeared, determined to rescue the maiden. She tried to dissuade him, but he vowed not to leave her side. While they spoke, the great beast emerged from his lair. Making the sign of the cross, George mounted his horse and charged the creature, wounding it with his lance. With the dragon now weakened, he called to the princess to throw him her girdle, and as soon as she had, he fastened it firmly around the dragon's neck. Wherever she walked, the dragon would now follow in tow, like a meek beast on a leash. The princess and St. George led the dragon back to the city, where the townsfolk were terrified. But St. George made them an offer, to kill the beast if they would be willing to be baptized and become Christians. 15,000 men, including the king himself, converted that day. George then cut off the head of the monster with his sword, and the body was carted out of the city on 4 ox carts. The king went on to build a church dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. George on the spot where the dragon died, and a clear spring flowed miraculously from its altar with water that could cure all disease. Notably, only the Latin version includes the part where the saint first wounds the dragon with the spear before killing it with his sword. Despite the incredible variety of portrayals of George in these stories, there seems to be enough historical evidence that the saint was at least a real person, with his death estimated to be in the early 3rd or 4th century, although it's difficult to say much more than that with any degree of certainty. It's interesting to note how Dedianus, sometimes portrayed as a governor, sometimes a Persian king, is referred to as a dragon in certain versions of the story. Whether metaphor or misunderstanding, perhaps it's this depiction of his monstrous nature that inspired the use of a literal dragon in later versions of the story. Images of heroic soldiers slaying devils, serpents and beasts, including this Romano-Egyptian carving from Alexandria that depicts a mounted Horus in Roman military uniform lancing a crocodile, had existed within the Christian world for some time as well. So it's not hard to imagine how the evocative image of a heroic soldier slaying a dragon might have taken hold in the popular imagination throughout regions touched by the Roman Empire. What's also interesting is that all the early accounts, from Eusebius to the apocryphal version and the canonical version, present St. George as a military figure of various ranks. Even the cruel Arian bishop, George of Cappadocia, who some detractors falsely claim to be the same George, had ties to the military, as a supplier of bacon to the Roman legions. So it's evident that before the knightly reinvention, there appears to be a strong military connection right from the start. The birthplace of St. George has long been contested, but Asia Minor, Palestine, North Africa and Cappadocia are the most often cited. Lydda in Palestine is widely considered the traditional site of his martyrdom and consequent burial. The earliest manuscripts already dated his death as 8 calends of May in the Roman calendar, marking the 23rd of April as the date of his martyrdom, and obviously now too the modern iteration of St. George's Day as a patron saint of England. Regardless of any confusion in the history of the figure, from the gruesome story of his martyrdom to the canonical versions, and the stories of a medieval fantasy knight, what remains consistent is his bravery and dedication to his faith in the face of adversity. And that's something people can universally appreciate and aspire to in their own lives and endeavours. No wonder then that he's inspired people of all manner of places and faiths for centuries. Now that I've gone some way to addressing why St. George is celebrated as a patron saint, and we've touched upon some of the stories that would have been known to the English at different points in the medieval period, let's take a brief dive into the history of how he came to be adopted as England's go-to protector and intercessor, up to the arguable peak of his celebrated status under the reign of Henry V and through to the end of the medieval period. There have been many theories throughout the ages about how St. George first came to England's shores. Some theorised he may have been born in Coventry, which led to a particularly strong devotion and association with the city. Some claimed he was a Roman soldier, following some of the ideas about his identity from stories we've heard so far, who came to England as part of Rome's expansion into Britain. But the truth is that he was already a popular figure before his name came to these shores. St. George had received papal approval. Pope Leo II had built a church dedicated to him in Rome, and the followers of St. George had expanded their influence into many regions of Europe, including the area that now constitutes France. It's possible that St. Augustine brought knowledge when St. Gregory the Great sent him on a mission to convert England in 596. However, no records from the 6th century appear to mention St. George in England. The actual arrival may well have come a bit later. Adamnan, the abbot of Iona, wrote the first records in the British Isles to mention St. George. It seems that he learned of the saint from Arculf, a bishop from Gaul, modern-day France. His work, De Locis Sanctis, included 2 miracles attributed to the saint, but no account of his life or his martyrdom. In the centuries that followed, his feast day began appearing in martyrologies, which listed many of the known saints at the time, and his martyrdom was commemorated by monastic communities who would read dedicated prayers to be given on feast days. Manuscripts like Elfrig's Life of Saints also spread recognition across the land. So St. George's Day had been introduced into the monastic calendar and was being observed by a host of people. It was only a matter of time before he would become known to the rest of England. It was a slow and steady process, but after becoming celebrated as more than just a standard feast day in Croyland in Lincoln and in Canterbury, the day began to increase in importance elsewhere too. This expansion of St. George's influence in medieval England was in large part due to the uncertainty of the era of the Crusades. With battles raging across the continent, spanning nearly 200 years, the survival of countrymen, fellow Christians, and even the Christian faith itself were all at stake. So the battlefield became an important focal point for the whole of medieval society to unite around. The Eastern Orthodox warrior saints inspired the wide acceptance of St. George, as throughout the Crusades, his martial reputation made him very popular among the ranks. Over time, his name was often invoked in battle cries, like, most familiar for us, centuries later when Shakespeare penned the famous line of the play Henry V, "God for Harry, England, and St. George." Living up to his role as protector of the English, St. George was believed by many of the faithful to have been present at a number of battles. One of the most famous appearances was said to have taken place in 1098 after a long and difficult siege on the city of Antioch. Taken from the Gesta Francorum, the men bore witness that appeared from the mountains a countless host of men on white horses, whose banners were all white. When our men saw this, they did not understand what was happening or who these men might be, until they realized that this was the succor sent by Christ, and that the leaders were St. George, St. Mercurius, and St. Demetrius. The very same document tells us that Crusaders visited the town of Ramla and selected a bishop to protect and build up the church in the place where they believed St. George's body rested. Interestingly, there's still a strong Christian presence there in the Holy Land today. As recently as November 2019, he's had a street named after him. Other important battles were also said to have been graced by an apparition of the saint who showed up to lead warriors to victory, such as the later Battle of Agincourt in 1415. This carol of St. George regales us of his exploits in the battle. Enforce we us with all our might to love St. George, our Lady Knight. Worship of virtue is the meed, and soweth him eye of right. To worship George then we have need, which is our sovereign lady's knight. He kept the maid from dragon's dread, and frayed all France and put to flight. At Agincourt, the chronicle you read, the French him see foremost in fight. In his virtue he wall us led against the fend, the full white, and with his banner us overspread, if we him love with all our might. Powerful stuff. While all this was going on, St. George's reinvention was already in full swing, as in 1266, just 4 years before the end of the Eighth Crusade, one of the most influential stories of the saint was spreading far and wide in the Golden Legend we mentioned earlier. This dragon-slaying version of the story, now having a life of its own alongside the story of the martyrdom, was so fixed in the public consciousness that only 7 years later, the first reference to the arms of St. George appearing on the battlefield to represent the English was recorded for Edward I's Welsh campaign. St. George's red cross on a white background had already been used as a military symbol since the time of Constantine and during the Crusades, but during the reign of Henry III, we can see the first time an explicitly English army carried the red cross into battle. It could perhaps have been to distinguish them from Simon de Montfort's opposing army who fought under the white cross. It wouldn't be until the rule of Henry VIII that this symbol of St. George became the principal flag of England, but it was already taking hold as a significant symbol for a portion of the English at the very least. The following 2 centuries saw St. George reach the peak of his recognition in these lands during the 100 Years' War. As in the Crusades, and with his versatile reputation as martyr, knight and dragon slayer, St. George was still a name invoked by the clergy, knights and soldiers, and increasingly by the monarchy, who adopted his image as a symbol of legitimacy and unity. During this time, in an attempt to garner loyalty and rally nobles to his cause in the war with France, Edward III wanted to found an order of knights. Equally inspired by his continental counterparts and Arthurian legend, he intended to style this order in the fashion of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. By the time King Edward heard the Arthurian legend, it would have been centuries in the making, with even the additional themes of the love of Lancelot and Guinevere and the Grail already firmly incorporated into the mythos by Chrétien de Troyes and his writings in the 12th century. It's clear that Arthur's knights and the newer, more chivalric version of St. George share a lot in common, and this fusion may be an early sign of the patriotic ideal he was to become for the nation of England as time went on. Unfortunately, the war was preoccupying Edward too much to see his plans to fruition when he first wanted in 1344, but just a few years later, by 1348, he had achieved what he set out to do, founding a slightly different and more religious knightly order under the patronage of the Virgin Mary, St. Edward and St. George. It was to be called the Order of the Garter, and it still exists to this day. The most popular story to explain the name, almost certainly a later romanticised fabrication, mentions a garter slipping from the Countess of Salisbury's leg while she was dancing at a court ball in Calais. Various courtiers seem to find this rather amusing, at which the king picked up the fallen garment, handing it back to the Countess, and declared, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks ill of it. This phrase became the motto of the order, still used to this day. Another legend attributes the founding of the illustrious order to an earlier king, Richard the Lionheart, who has been said to have had 26 of his most trusted knights wear a blue thong of leather around their legs. The true origin of the symbolic garter, though, may have been referring to a different item of clothing altogether, as the so-called garter may have signified a blue and gold arming buckle used to identify fighters in battle. The motto itself actually refers to the English claim for the throne, rather than a lady's underwear that had fallen to the floor. The link to St. George is also noteworthy, given that the tying of the princess's girdle around the dragon's neck forms part of the common dragon-slaying version of the narrative. In fact, his centrality to the ethos of the order was rather explicit, since it wasn't long until he was given the honour of becoming primary patron of the order, ahead of St Edward and of the Virgin Mary, no less. These royal knights were not the only knightly order dedicated to the warrior saint. But, although he still remained more a symbol of Christian knighthood in general than just of the English at this time, it's clear that on the battlefield and within the halls of power, St George had already become an important symbol across the land, as his fame continued to grow and he became more entrenched as a local folkloric character, also becoming a friend to the common man, who were keen to claim him as one of their own. Local legends from Warwickshire, Herefordshire, and unsurprisingly, the hamlet of St George in Derbyshire claim to be the place of the saint's encounter with the dragon. One example from Uffington in Oxfordshire explains that the reason no grass grows on the summit of a local hill is because it's the place where George fought the dragon, and the reason nothing will grow there is because the dragon's blood poisoned the soil. Another indication of the popularity of St George among the masses in the 14th century is that local religious guilds devoted to St George were starting to appear, showing that the devotion spread beyond the clergy, the nobility and the monarchy, and out to the people in cities, towns and parishes across England. These guilds were central to creating communities in the Middle Ages, as well as being responsible for charitable work. So to be part of a guild of St George would be a point of pride for many, giving extra cause for celebration every time the 23rd of April would come around. The celebrations of St George in England continued to grow, peaking towards the end of the medieval period. In 1415, the same year as the fateful English victory at the Battle of Agincourt, the province of Canterbury, covering the southern half of England, was emboldened to elevate the feast day to a major double feast, putting it essentially on par with Christmas. Having the day held in such unusually high regard meant that, like Christmas, church attendance was mandatory and the faithful were required to abstain from all manual labour. It only took the northern half of the country 6 years to follow suit, when in 1421, St George's Day also became a major double feast in the province of York. Thus, St George had managed to attain an incredible level of devotion from all of England. And there we have it, the story of the stratospheric rise of a legendary icon. So the question is, how did the saint go from being held in such high regard for hundreds of years to abiding the current apathy and ignorance of both him and his feast day in modern-day England? If you'd like to find out, I'll be covering St George's fall from grace in part 2 of this, my first ever attempt at a mini-series. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do like and subscribe if you did, and I will be making more very soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.